Dustin Messer Radio Hour, a 30-minute podcast in which I skim books and interview people. Before we get to our great guest, who I'm interviewing here in a moment, I wanted to talk about what I'm skimming. And what I'm skimming these days are the 18 volume, and they're really short. That sounds more impressive than it is. They're almost booklets, like think academic journal type things, called The Real Calvin Coolidge. Now, 18 volumes. Some of them are more academic, sort of assessing Coolidge. Some are just sort of, an inside glimpse into a president's life, that kind of thing. I got to volume 6 of The Real Calvin Coolidge. And I kid you not, if you follow me on Twitter, I tweeted this out. I kid you not, volume 6, like the second to last essay, you can Google this, is that time, no, excuse me, the time Cal used cocaine. In volume 6, if Calvin Coolidge, if Silent Cal is bumping the powder in the Red Room, that should be, volume 1. That should be volume 1 to 9, explaining to us how Calvin Coolidge was, doing blow on company time. Unbelievable. Anyways, you read it, and as you might guess, may not guess, it's not exactly as it sounds. In some ways, it's weirder than it sounds. So it's written by his doctor, and here's the story the doctor accounts, which to me, again, is almost more bizarre than picturing, Richard Simmons, in the bowling alley with Silent Cal, snorting cocaine. This is in some ways worse. By the way, someone tweeted back, he was a proto Mitch McConnell, which, Cocaine Cal has an amazing ring to it. So here's what the doctor does. He's writing the story, this amusing anecdote about the time Silent Cal used cocaine. What happened was Calvin Coolidge was sick. He had like a cold, and he goes to the doctor, and he tells the doctor, I don't feel well. And he says, I've heard that if you put a little bit of cocaine in your ear, you'll feel better. And so, the doctor says, oh no, that's not, that's an old wives' tale. It's not a real thing. And Cal says, well, I think it is a real thing. I'd like to try it. And the doctor, who just said cocaine is not good for medicinal purposes, says, all right, if you insist, and pulls cocaine out of his doctor's bag. What? If I were the doctor, I would think I was in some sort of, setup. He keeps pushing me on, no, I really do want the cocaine. You have it on you, don't you? Anyways, he gets it out. He puts it in Cal's ear. Needless to say, it does not work. He goes to dinner. I was expecting him to say, it was like the first night, Cal, just no one could get him to shut up. His leg was bouncing under the deal. Not what happened. Instead, he, it just made him ill, as you would expect. And the funniest part, besides, I guess, Calvin Coolidge doing cocaine in the White House, is the doctor at the end says, yeah, so he asked me to do this. It doesn't work. And he says, and I know this because I'm the doctor. And I tell him, cocaine isn't going to help your earache. It's only exacerbated. It still gives the president cocaine. The funniest part is he ends it saying, as Calvin Coolidge's, mentor once told me, and I forget the exact line, but something about, oh, Cal can sure be, persnickety or odd about his medical habits. As if somehow, as a doctor, this gets him out of the situation of giving Calvin Coolidge cocaine, as if a patient could come to him and say, I scabbed my knee. Can you rub some meth on it? He would say, no, that's not going to work. But if you insist, I'll rub meth on your leg. I assume people ask their doctors for all sorts of weird things, and it's incumbent upon the doctor. And actually, I literally had not thought of this until this moment. So this could be wrong. This is in no way fact checked. I believe in the Calvin Coolidge biography, and this shows you that I was not planning on this. Whoever wrote it, the lady who wrote it, she also just wrote the new book on LBJ and the Great Society. Anyways, the best Coolidge biography. I believe she gives the impression of the doctor, and I don't know if it's the same doctor who wrote that. Maybe he had more than one doctor, but she gives the impression of a doctor. It wouldn't surprise me if it's the cocaine doctor, of being something of sort of a rebel rouser or like a gadfly, kind of what's the Dick Morris type character in the White House, sort of, stirring conflict between the factions in the White House. Anyways, I'm reading those. The cocaine chapter highlight, and he's our most, in some ways, our most austere president, and has an incredible life. He, his son Calvin Jr., and I don't know if this doctor aided Calvin Jr. or not, but Calvin Jr. was playing tennis on the White House courts, gets a blister. This is just years, not many years before antibiotics are invented, and goes septic and dies like within a week of the tennis match from that blister. And Coolidge, who I think is our best president, to his great credit, he was either running for election or had just won. But again, in the biography, and forgive me for slipping her name, because it really is a wonderful biography, even if you're not interested in Calvin Coolidge. She paints this beautiful picture of him in the face of his son's death, going out of, and he never talks about it. His wife never talks about it until after they're out of office. And of course, Cal only lives, a handful of more years, so far as I know, drug-free, after getting out of the White House. Anyways, that is what I'm skimming. I could draw a connection between that and our guest, but I will not do it, except to say Jeff Ventrella. I'll do a sort of a bigger introduction here in a second. But Jeff has written a wonderful book on the ways in which law and culture relate to one another. And actually, Calvin Coolidge does have a lot to say about the way in which a culture has to support and buttress a law, particularly positive law. So there's some connection there. All right, let's go to our interview with the man Hugh Hewitt calls the smartest person he knows, Jeff Ventrella. Jeff Ventrella is with us right now. Jeff has a new book out called Law Follows Culture, Except When It Doesn't. And I'm going to ask him about it, but before I do, I just want to say he's a senior counsel and a senior vice president at the Alliance for Defending Freedom, and someone I am very proud to call a friend. Jeff, thank you for being with me.
I am delighted, Dustin, to be able to contribute, and it's always encouraging to me to dialogue with you.
Well, that's a good place to start, is we were going to dialogue in person this month, but we obviously are not doing that because neither of us are able to travel. You just did a pretty sweeping interview on some of the legal ramifications of the coronavirus, so don't feel like you have to rehearse all of that. But as a lawyer, what are some of the things we should be watching out for that this crisis could have legal ramifications? What are some of the things that maybe we're not looking at?
That's right. And when we live in a constitutional republic, there's oftentimes tensions and sometimes conflicts, not necessary conflicts, that exist when the state, which is designed to promote the health and welfare through its police powers, such as stay-at-home orders and so forth, conflicts with other rights it's deemed to protect, such as associational rights, religious exercise rights, and speech rights. And so, and we need to watch out for is extremes on both sides. So what I mean by that is a temporary order to quarantine or to self-quarantine is certainly within the lawful parameters of the local governments, the states and so forth, but would not be constitutional in every case to permanently uh, require disbursement or permanently require the shutting down of gatherings. We should also watch out for any type of state action that specifically targets religious expression, religious gatherings. For example, in Greensboro, North Carolina, pro-life protesters in complete compliance with the coronavirus orders were arrested recently because they were praying and speaking pro-life messages near an abortion clinic. Those are the kinds of things that we need to look out for when there's an overreach that goes beyond reasonability or necessity, particularly if it's more than temporally.
Well, no one is better, I think, at talking about the ways in which law and culture interact with one another. And that's the subject of your book, which I found to be extremely helpful. I'll link to it. But if people haven't read it yet, it's called Law Follows Culture, Except When It Doesn't. If you could just explain that title, and probably in explaining the title, you'll explain a lot of the book. But tell us a little bit about the book.
You bet, and thank you for those kind words. Basically, my burden there is to deal with some of the slogans that go around in the circles that we run in, worldview circles, Christian circles. It's certainly the case. People say politics is downstream from culture, and we use bumper stickers like law follows culture. But what do we mean by that? And so what I want to argue is that they are mutual causes of one another. They are mutually catalytic. That is to say that law follows culture, but also culture follows law. And one thing that I do in there is show that we've got our categories kind of mixed up. And that is that law is what mankind does, positive law, the state, the legislature, and that sort of thing. And because it's a human endeavor, it's cultural. So we have our categories right. Creation's what God does, and culture is what mankind does. And mankind certainly does law. So law and culture, law is culture.
Yeah.
And so the point is that anytime that we have something that's legal, it sends a legal message for sure, but it also sends a cultural message. And I wanted to begin prompting people to think in those categories, to look at the implications of what's going on, because these things swirl and mutually reinforce and catalyze a lot of those currents that are going on in our life in society.
Yeah, I'm going to ask about positive law here in a second, but had I not read your book, I would have asked you, what is culture? But you spend some time at the beginning to say, culture, as you just said, I mean, isn't one thing, it's an amalgamation of different things. So could you kind of just walk us through what is culture?
Good point. So I would say that culture is what mankind does. And as Henry Van Til said, it's religion externalized. It's basically our basic assumptions that we bring with us as humans. And then as we begin to work and live, that becomes culture. But it's not just one culture. There are cultures, and many of them fight for dominance. So it's this swirling kind of soup that really occurs. And so it's not really accurate to say the culture. It's more accurate to say the cultures. There are multiple cultures because it reflects multiple actions of individuals, of smaller groups, and of entire societies. Those are the cultures that are out there.
And so that's culture, and we could think of plausibility structures, stories we tell ourselves. You talk at one point about cultural homilies, and we don't really think about singers or actors or reality stars being preachers. But if we think of these worldviews, these cultures as religions, their spokesmen in the public square are going to be these zeitgeist leaders, like singers, like pop stars. As that's the case, how does law relate to that culture? In other words, sometimes we think of cultures being or laws being a cultural artifact, but you talk about culture being a legal artifact. In other words, you list maybe 10 or 15 really important Supreme Court cases that have shaped our zeitgeist, that have shaped our culture. So how do we can think of culture influencing law, but how does law influence what we think of as culture?
Yeah, those are great questions, and we go back first to the scripture. I would say the Apostle Paul himself tells us in Romans chapter 7 that I wouldn't know what coveting is unless the law said you shall not covet. And this points to the idea that not only do ideas have consequences, but ideas require translators and transmitters. And so when our legal institutions announce a rule, that is a rule that grants permission or withholds permission for certain kinds of conduct and that sort of thing. When that gets in the amalgam, then the culture responds to that, the various cultures, and then begins to implement along what that law has articulated. So what happens is there's this reverberation effect. One good example of that I talk about is the notion of eugenics. The progressives in the late 19th and early century were very much into social Darwinism, the idea that we can control and manufacture literally mankind's future. Well intended for the better. That's what eugenic means. Francis Galton coined the term. Better living kind of a thing. Well, the problem with, of course, is that this created things like forced sterilization, forced institutionalism. Interestingly enough, the states looked at this and they passed those laws, but then people said, that's not right. You can't coerce people. You can't, being fertile is not a pathology. We can't just involuntarily sterilize people. And so what happened is 7 different states filed lawsuits and stopped those sterilization eugenic laws. We thought that was the end of it until the pro-eugenic culture made a national case of it out of Virginia. And then the United States Supreme Court, speaking through one of its most iconic jurists, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, basically said, you know what, 3 generations of idiots is enough. And we're gonna affirm this. Once that happened, it became a catalyst. It was a cultural signal that then generated a lot of promotion for and ultimately implementation of additional sterilization, which was only stopped by another cultural event, World War II. Began to see how ugly the Nazis were in being logically consistent with eugenic theory. So I hope that gives some peek into how those things interrelate.
It really doesn't. The big, I think, takeaway from me from the book was it seems like evangelicals vacillate between saying politics is everything and let's just invest in sort of legal battles and so forth, or going the other direction saying, no, let's just be, quote unquote, culture changers and not worry about religious liberty or the legal side. And your book did a great job of showing you just can't split law and culture in half, and there are gonna be people whose primary contribution to the kingdom is in music and film and television, and other people are gonna be fighting legal battles, and we ought not pit those things against one another.
That's exactly right. And if I'm right that law is just a form of a cultural artifact, it then shows a liberty of one's calling to be able to impact and not feel shame or guilt about not being involved in, quote, one or the other. We need to understand that those things ought to be aligned, and we need to recognize that how they influence others. And so when people criticize, oh, you shouldn't have this kind of a law because it's going to lose. Well, but it sends a cultural signal. It makes it plausible to again be talking about these kinds of issues. In the same way, when we make a cultural artifact of a film or a novel or of a picture, it allows the law then to think, oh, is that something that ought to be regulated? Or maybe we should not regulate those kinds of things. It provides that moral imagination to say, yeah, let's talk about what that should look like in the public square.
This was a good teaser, I think, to the book, and I would encourage people to get the book if they want to hear more about what you have to say on that. Real quick, if it's okay, not the last time, it's the first time you and I met was in San Jose, and I don't know if you'll remember this, but we had cigars, and I asked you about several different people, just historical figures, presidents, theologians, and you kind of just gave off the cuff impressions of the people. And that stuck with me as a really fun night. And so I was going to try to recreate that. So I have five people here. If you could just give maybe a 1 or 2 paragraph summary of their life, their thought, and kind of an assessment of their thinking in our current culture. So here they are. First one, Henry Van Til.
Van Til wrote a seminal book, in my view, called The Calvinistic Concept of Culture, something along those lines. And what he did is he took kind of a Abraham Kuyperian view and began drilling down and showing the propriety of considering these cultural issues. In other words, not taste not, touch not, and showing that the Lordship of Christ informs each of these areas, and that we ought to take those thoughts captive for Christ as well. And I think he was the one who penned the notion that culture is religion externalized, that there are, humankind is inherently a religious creature, and always a creature. And those creatures are designed to worship, and they either worship in a deformed way or in a faithful way. And so that the culture they produced is either faithfully worshipful or it's unfaithfully worshipful. And culture will necessarily reflect that religion that's going on in the heart of mankind.
I won't ask follow-up questions to the rest of them, but just for this one, the Calvinistic conception of culture, kind of dated. Are there any books that make a similar case but are maybe more up to date that you'd recommend?
Yes, I think that a number of the monographs and short writings of Andrew Sandlin really apply these kinds of concepts, as well as it's nearly magisterial. Joe Boot's book, The Mission of God, takes this from a number of areas and demonstrates the epistemic lordship. And then to another degree, the writings of John Frame on particular topics, whether that's worship or epistemology, I think are great applications of what Henry Van Til was talking about.
Really helpful, changing gears, as you will see. Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Oliver Wendell Holmes is a long reigning, well-regarded jurist, first in the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, and then later on the United States Supreme Court. Very articulate, very good with rhetoric and the words, very bright man, demonstrably opposed to higher law, demonstrably opposed to a Christian world and life view, and set out to undermine it. And he did that by taking swats at both the common law as well as natural law, which was the prime way of thinking about law from Sir William Blackstone into the founding and then the later centuries. Holmes and some of his colleagues, one in psychology, one in politics, designed to uproot and essentially undermine the notion that there is a law above the law and that sort of thing, and really would not represent a Christian jurisprudence whatsoever. Very skilled man, but as Cornelius Van Til said, it's like a very sharp saw at an angle.
Chuck Colson.
Chuck Colson, a redeemed life in the fullest sense, a person understanding the sinfulness of his sin, God opening his eyes, and then following with a therefore. That is to say, taking those great skills as a Marine, as a lawyer, as a political thinker, and then channeling them to extant cultural needs, not only broad needs in terms of a Christian world and life view, but also dealing with the deplorable system that we have in America in our penitentiaries and prison systems, and developing actual, more biblically based notions of restitution and repentance-based systems to rehabilitate and promote the gospel throughout that entire system. And then, of course, his development of what was called the Centurion Program, now the Colson Fellows Program, to really incubate and then launch people in all walks of life with an active, vibrant faith. A very godly man. I note that his wife, Patty, just passed in the last week since we're recording this. And I did not, I think I'd shaken hands with maybe both of them once, but I certainly regarded him highly and admire his thinking. And I would also say this, and he got a lot of flack for this, I think, wrongly so, but he understood that the core of Christian orthodoxy permits Catholics and evangelicals together to set forth an orthodox world and life view, including the ethics and sociology that goes with those great traditions of Christendom.
You gave a wonderful talk, but the best title of any talk I've ever heard was yours, and it was, you probably know what I'm going to say, Sex in the City of God.
Sure.
A brilliant title that I wish I had a thought of. It's been long enough. I may just write something and steal it.
There you go.
The only character still alive on here, and I have another one after him, but Jimmy Carter.
James Earl Carter, president, elected in 1976. I was not able to participate in that election by a few months. Very interesting times, post-Nixon time. Professing Christian, Sunday school teacher. I knew some people that went to the Naval Academy with him, actually, so I could tell some inside stories there. We thought at the time he was a nice man, and I've not veered from that. Seems to be a kind man. I think and I have no reason to doubt his Christian profession as being genuine. However, I would say it's a very uninformed one, that many of his policy articulations, and now he's very veered way off orthodoxy with respect to marital ethics and some of those kinds of issues. I think he represents what we would call a two kingdom or a bifurcated separationist view with respect to faith. Faith is personal, it's in my heart, it's toward God, and the public square is not really informed by faith other than to just be nice. And I think a very ineffectual president in terms of his politics, and not a very effective leader during a time of great economic drawback and so forth. Again, respect his manner and those sorts of things, but not the worst president of the 20th century. That would go to the also professing Christian Woodrow Wilson. It's another story for another time.
In the lead-in here, you won't have heard it, but in the lead-in, I was talking about who I think is the best president we've had, Calvin Coolidge, a good opposite to Wilson.
Exactly right. Just reading about him today in Brad Watson's new book, Coolidge, I think, is only going to grow in appreciation given his articulations and his commitment to the actual Constitution.
Yeah. Well, speaking of commitment to the Constitution, I will leave you, last one, talking about someone I know you'll have affection for, Antonin Scalia.
Yes, Justice Scalia. I wouldn't say we were tight friends, but we did know each other and got to hang out on a number of occasions. Very interesting fellow, English major, so very facile with respect to grammar and rhetoric, sharp as a whip, of course. He was, along with Judge Bork, really the linchpin who built out the notion, along with General Meese, of course, this notion of originalism. That is to say, fidelity of the text. He would often say things like, the Constitution says what it says and it doesn't say what it doesn't say. That is to say that jurists ought to be bound by the text of the Constitution, and they're not super legislators. Now, he got some hits. He was a very faithful Christian man as well. And there's some interesting stories of his piety, and he just really loved people and would look out for them and do a lot of things in private from a charitable standpoint and whatnot. However, his view was not necessarily a traditional Catholic view, though he affirmed and believed in the natural law, particularly Aquinas' version of it, but he was reluctant to utilize the natural law tradition with respect to any jurisprudential enterprise. And there's a good debate on that, but his biggest concern was sinful man ought not to go beyond the text. They need to be restrained. And I've had meals with him, I've dined with him, I've had wine with him, laughed with him, and it was a great blow when he passed away. He leaves a legacy now that he'll go down in history as one of the greatest jurists in the same breath and category of people like John Marshall.
Hmm. Jeff, you're one of the busiest people I know, and you're one of the most generous people I know with your time. I really appreciate you talking with us. Lord willing, we'll be together in San Francisco in several months. We'll see. But I really appreciate you giving your time and talking with us.
My pleasure, Dustin. We'll see you face to face, God willing, before that. And if I can help you in any way, let me know. Love doing these kinds of things. God bless you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Take care. Bye-bye.
My thanks to Jeff Ventrella for being our first guest on the Dustin Messer Radio Hour. My thanks to you for watching. In between the interview with Jeff and now, I've had an opportunity to fact check the story about the doctor giving Cal cocaine, and if that doctor was the one who was causing trouble in the White House, and I did not seize that opportunity. So while I had the opportunity to fact check that, I did not take it. I have no more information to give on that score, but it's a pretty safe bet if there was a doctor causing trouble in the White House. And what we know about one doctor is that he does have cocaine in his pocket. Another doctor probably doesn't, because how many doctors do you know carry coke in their pocket? I think it's safe to say, it's the doctor on the snow lift who's the issue. So again, thanks to Jeff. Biography of Calvin Coolidge, I recommend. LBJ and the Great Society. I have not read, can't even say I've skimmed it. I've read some reviews of it. It's apparently really good. I encourage you to get that too. All right. Join us next time for another stimulating conversation and a book skimmed. See you next time. Bye.